Margaret Chin had always been different from the other photographers at the Tribune newspaper. While her colleagues rushed around with the latest digital cameras worth thousands of dollars, she carefully carried her grandfather's 1940s Leica camera in a worn leather bag. The old camera looked ancient compared to the sleek modern equipment that filled the newsroom, its metal body showing scratches and dents from decades of use. Every morning, Margaret would arrive at the Tribune building 30 minutes early, not because she was particularly eager, but because she needed extra time to load film into her camera while others simply checked their battery levels and memory cards. The ritual had become second nature to her over the past 3 years since joining the newspaper. She would sit at her small desk in the corner of a newsroom, carefully threading 35mm film through the mechanical parts of a Leica, making sure everything was perfectly aligned. The other photographers found her methods amusing at best, frustrating at worst. During editorial meetings, when assignments were handed out, Margaret often heard whispered comments about her antique equipment and stubborn, old-fashioned ways. Some of her colleagues wondered aloud why the newspaper even kept her on staff when she took so much longer to deliver photos than everyone else. Sarah Martinez, the lead photographer, was particularly vocal about Margaret's equipment choices. Sarah carried top-of-the-line digital cameras that could shoot hundreds of photos in minutes and upload them instantly to the newsroom computers. She often made jokes about Margaret's need to find darkrooms in an age when everyone else was editing photos on laptops in coffee shops. The tension became more obvious during breaking news situations. When a fire broke out at the downtown warehouse district, all the photographers rushed to the scene, while Sarah and others snapped hundreds of digital photos, instantly reviewing them on their camera screens and sending the best shots back to the office via wireless transmission. Margaret worked methodically with her film camera. She could only take 36 shots before needing to change rolls, and she had no way to see the results until the film was developed. By the time Margaret returned to the newsroom and developed her film in the small darkroom the newspaper still maintained mostly for her use, Sarah's photos were already being prepared for the evening edition. Margaret's photos, though carefully composed and technically excellent, arrived too late to be considered for the front page. This pattern repeated itself week after week. Margaret's work was consistently good, sometimes exceptional, but it was almost always overshadowed by the speed and convenience of digital photography. Her editor, James Morrison, had begun questioning whether keeping a film photographer on staff made sense in the fast-paced world of modern journalism. During their monthly performance review, Morrison sat across from Margaret in his cluttered office, surrounded by stacks of newspapers and journalism awards. He looked uncomfortable as he addressed the elephant in the room. "Margaret, your work quality has never been in question," he began, adjusting his glasses nervously. "But the industry is moving fast, and our readers expect immediate coverage. When news breaks, we need photos within hours, not days." Margaret had heard variations of this conversation before. She understood the business reality of modern newspapers, but she also knew something her colleagues didn't understand. The Leica camera wasn't just a family heirloom or a stubborn preference for outdated technology. It represented something much deeper, something connected to her grandfather's service in World War II and the stories he had never fully told. Her grandfather, Chun Wei-ming, had immigrated to America after the war, bringing very little with him except this camera and a small collection of photographs he had taken during his service. He had worked as a portrait photographer for decades, using the same Leica to capture weddings, graduations, and family portraits in her neighborhood. When he passed away, he left the camera to Margaret with specific instructions written in his careful handwriting. The note, which Margaret kept folded in her wallet, simply said, "This camera has seen both the worst and best of humanity. Use it to find truth, not just pictures." Margaret had studied photography in college, learning both digital and film techniques, but something about the weight and mechanical precision of a Leica felt right in her hands. The deliberate process of loading film, manually adjusting settings, and carefully composing each shot forced her to think more carefully about every image she captured. But Explaining this to her colleagues or her editor seemed impossible. How could she tell them that the camera carried emotional significance beyond professional efficiency? How could she explain that the careful, methodical process of film photography helped her see details and moments that digital photographers often missed in their rush to capture everything? Instead, Margaret simply nodded during her review with Morrison and promised to consider upgrading her equipment. She knew that her job security depended on finding a way to bridge the gap between her preferred methods and the newspaper's practical needs. That evening, Margaret sat in her small apartment, cleaning the Leica camera as her grandfather had taught her. She carefully wiped down the lens and checked the mechanical components, just as he had done every night after work. The apartment walls were covered with prints she had made in her home darkroom, images that captured quiet moments of human connection that she felt were missing from much of modern photography. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Sarah. "Heard Morrison talk to you about the camera situation. You know we all like you, right? It's just business." Margaret appreciated the gesture, but she also knew that her colleagues saw her as a relic, someone clinging to outdated methods in a world that had moved beyond them. She began to wonder if they were right. Maybe it was time to put the Leica away and embrace the digital age like everyone else. The next morning brought news that would change everything. Morrison called the entire photography staff into the conference room, his face showing the kind of excitement that only came with major story assignments. "We've got something special," he announced, spreading several documents across the conference table. The Veterans Administration is releasing previously classified documents about World War II reconnaissance missions. Apparently, there are some incredible untold stories about photographers who documented classified operations behind enemy lines. Margaret felt her heart rate increase as Morrison continued explaining the assignment. The VA was planning a special exhibition honoring military photographers who had risked their lives to document the war, and they wanted the Tribune to do a feature story connecting those historical photographers to modern photojournalism. "This could be a really significant piece," Morrison said, looking around the room at his staff. "We're talking about photographers who carried cameras into active combat zones, documenting things that wouldn't be declassified for decades. The exhibition opens next month, and we've got exclusive access to interview some of the surviving veterans." Sarah immediately volunteered to lead the assignment, citing her experience with portrait photography and her efficient digital workflow. But something in Morrison's expression suggested he had already made a decision about who would handle this particular story. Margaret stayed quiet during the meeting, but her mind was racing. She thought about her grandfather's war stories, the few details he had shared about his service, and the careful way he had always handled the Leica camera. Could there be a connection between this assignment and her family's history? After the meeting, Morrison approached Margaret privately. "I want you to handle this veteran's story," he said quietly. "I know it seems counterintuitive given our recent conversations about your equipment, but something tells me you're the right person for this job." Margaret felt a mixture of gratitude and pressure. This could be her chance to prove that her approach to photography had value beyond speed and convenience. But it could also be her last opportunity to justify keeping her job if the story didn't meet expectations. That night, Margaret called her mother to ask about her grandfather's war service. Her mother, Linda Chun, had always been reluctant to discuss those years, saying that her father had preferred to focus on his life in America rather than dwelling on his wartime experiences. "He never talked much about the war," Linda explained over the phone. "But I remember he kept a small box of photographs and documents that he never showed anyone. After he died, I put it in storage because it seemed too personal to go through." Margaret asked if she could look through the box, explaining about the newspaper assignment. Linda agreed, though she warned that the contents might be difficult to understand without more context about her grandfather's specific role during the war. The next day was Saturday, and Margaret drove to her mother's house to retrieve the storage box. It was smaller than she had expected, made of dark wood with brass corners that had tarnished over the decades. Inside, she found several rolls of undeveloped film, a few developed photographs, and a collection of documents written in both English and Chinese. Most surprising was a small leather journal filled with her grandfather's handwriting, documenting his experiences as what appeared to be a reconnaissance photographer with American forces in the Pacific Theater. The entries were brief and factual, but they described situations that sounded incredibly dangerous and important to the war effort. One entry, dated September 1943, simply said, "Photographed enemy positions on Tarawa. Lost 2 cameras to water damage during landing. Leica survived. Images successful." Another entry from early 1944 mentioned photographing classified installations and noted that the resulting images had been immediately sent to Intelligence Command. Margaret realized that her grandfather's Leica camera had documented some of the most dangerous and important reconnaissance missions of World War II. The camera she carried to photograph city council meetings and local events had once captured images that helped Allied forces plan crucial military operations. More importantly, she understood that her grandfather's careful, methodical approach to photography hadn't been just a personal preference. In combat situations where every shot counted and film was precious, military photographers had to be precise and deliberate with every image they captured. There was no room for taking hundreds of photos and hoping some would work out. As Margaret read through more of her grandfather's journal entries, she began to understand that her own careful approach to photography wasn't outdated or inefficient. It was a continuation of a tradition that valued precision, thoughtfulness, and respect for the power of images to document truth. Margaret spent the entire weekend going through her grandfather's war documents with growing amazement. The small wooden box contained far more than she had expected. Beyond the journal entries and undeveloped film, she discovered official military correspondence, commendation letters, and photograph prints that showed scenes she had never imagined her quiet grandfather witnessing. The photographs revealed a side of Chen Wei-ming that her family had never known. Instead of the gentle portrait photographer who had spent decades taking wedding pictures in their neighborhood, these images showed him documenting some of the most intense moments of the Pacific War. There were pictures of military operations, destroyed enemy positions, and American soldiers in situations that clearly required incredible courage to photograph. What struck Margaret most was the technical quality of the images. Despite being taken under extreme conditions with limited resources, every photograph showed the same careful composition and attention to detail that she remembered from her grandfather's peacetime work. Even in combat situations, he had maintained the methodical approach that she had inherited and that her colleagues now criticized. One photograph particularly caught her attention. He had been a reconnaissance specialist whose images had directly contributed to military planning and strategy. The careful, deliberate approach to photography that seemed so outdated in the modern newsroom had once been essential for gathering intelligence that saved lives and won battles. Monday morning brought a new understanding of her assignment. Margaret arrived at the Tribune building with her grandfather's war documents carefully organized in a folder. She planned to research whether any of his work might be included in the Veterans Administration exhibition, but first she needed to attend the regular editorial meeting. Morrison had scheduled interviews with 3 surviving World War II veteran photographers for later that week. The Veterans Administration had provided contact information for elderly men who had served as military photographers and were willing to share their stories for the newspaper feature. During the meeting, Sarah expressed frustration that the assignment was moving forward with fill photography. Wouldn't it make more sense to use modern equipment to photograph these elderly veterans? She asked. We could get better image quality and faster turnaround for the story. Margaret remained quiet, but Morrison defended his decision. This story is about connecting past and present, he explained. I think there's value in using similar techniques to what these veterans would have used during their service. After the meeting, Margaret approached Morrison privately and shared what she had discovered about her grandfather's war service. She showed him several of the photographs and journal entries, explaining that her family had never known the extent of his military contributions. Morrison examined the documents carefully, his expression growing more interested as he realized the significance of what Margaret had uncovered. "This is remarkable," he said finally. "Your grandfather was involved in some of the most dangerous reconnaissance missions of the war. These photographs could be historically significant." He suggested that Margaret contact the Veterans Administration to see if any of her grandfather's work was included in their upcoming exhibition. If so, it could add a powerful personal dimension to the newspaper's feature story. Margaret spent the afternoon on the phone with various VA departments, trying to track down information about her grandfather's service records. The process was complicated by the fact that many reconnaissance missions had been classified for decades after the war, and some records were still being processed for public release. Finally, she reached a historian named Dr. Robert Mitchell, who specialized in World War II military photography. When Margaret described her grandfather's service and mentioned some of the details from his journal entries, Dr. Mitchell became very interested. "Chen Wei-ming," he repeated, checking his records. "Yes, I have extensive files on his work. He was one of our most effective reconnaissance photographers in the Pacific Theater. His images from Tarawa and several other operations provided crucial intelligence for invasion planning." Dr. Mitchell explained that Margaret's grandfather had volunteered for extremely dangerous assignments, often working alone behind enemy lines to photograph strategic targets. His technical skill and calm under pressure had made him invaluable to military intelligence operations. He received several commendations for his service, Dr. Mitchell continued, including a Silver Star for heroism during a reconnaissance mission in 1944. His photographs of enemy fortifications helped save hundreds of American lives during the subsequent invasion. Margaret felt her heart stop. Her grandfather had received a Silver Star, one of the military's highest honors for valor in combat, and her family had never known about it. The gentleman who had photographed her childhood birthdays and school events had been a war hero whose courage and skill had made a significant difference in the outcome of crucial battles. Dr. Mitchell invited Margaret to visit the VA archives to see the complete collection of her grandfather's war photographs and documentation. Many of the images would be displayed in the upcoming exhibition, and some had never been shown to the public because of their sensitive nature. That evening, Margaret called her mother to share what she had learned. Linda Chan was shocked to hear about her father's Silver Star and military recognition. "He never mentioned any awards or medals," she said quietly. "After the war, he just wanted to build a peaceful life and never talked about what he had done overseas." Margaret realized that her grandfather's humble nature had prevented him from sharing the full story of his service, even with his own family. The careful, methodical approach to photography that had made him effective in combat situations had carried over into his civilian life, but he had never explained the connection or the significance of his wartime experiences. The next day, Margaret visited the Veterans Administration archives with her grandfather's Leica camera and the documents from the wooden box. Dr. Mitchell met her in the research room, surrounded by filing cabinets and computer terminals dedicated to preserving military history. "Your grandfather's work is really exceptional," Dr. Mitchell explained as he pulled out a thick file folder. Military photographers during World War II worked under conditions that would be unimaginable for modern journalists. They had limited film, no ability to see their results immediately, and often had to work in active combat zones. He showed Margaret official military documents that detailed her grandfather's assignments and commendations. The language was formal and brief, but it described situations that required extraordinary courage and technical skill. One report from 1944 described Chen Wei-ming as having demonstrated exceptional valor and professional competence while conducting photographic reconnaissance under enemy fire. His images provided intelligence crucial to the success of Operation Forger and directly contributed to reducing American casualties during the invasion of Saipan. Margaret learned that her grandfather had developed techniques for protecting his camera equipment in harsh conditions, methods that had been adopted by other military photographers throughout the Pacific Theater. His careful maintenance of the Leica camera had kept it functioning through situations that destroyed other equipment. "The camera he left you isn't just a family heirloom," Dr. Mitchell explained. It's a piece of military history that documented some of the most important operations of the war. The fact that it's still functional after all these years is a testament to both the quality of the equipment and your grandfather's care in maintaining it. Dr. Mitchell arranged for Margaret to interview two of the surviving veterans who had worked with her grandfather during the war. Both men, now in their late 90s, remembered Chun Wei-ming clearly and had stories about his courage and technical expertise that had never been recorded. Frank Morrison, a former Marine who had served as a combat photographer, recalled working with Margaret's grandfather during the Tarawa operation. Chun was fearless, he said during their interview. While the rest of us were trying to stay safe and still get decent pictures, he would move right up to the action to get exactly the shot that intelligence needed. He saved a lot of lives with those photographs. The other veteran, James Rodriguez, who had been a photography technician responsible for developing film under battlefield conditions, remembered Chen's meticulous attention to detail. Most of us were just hoping our film would turn out okay, Rodriguez explained. But Chun treated every frame like it might be the most important picture of the war. He was right more often than not. Through these interviews, Margaret began to understand that her grandfather's careful approach to photography hadn't been cautious or old-fashioned. In combat situations where mistakes could cost lives, his precision and thoughtfulness had made him one of the most effective military photographers of his generation. Margaret also learned that the Leica camera had been chosen for reconnaissance missions specifically because of its reliability and mechanical precision. Digital cameras might be faster and more convenient, but they also required batteries, computer systems, and other technology that could fail in extreme conditions. The mechanical simplicity of the Leica made it dependable when dependability was literally a matter of life and death. As the week continued, Margaret realized that her assignment was becoming much more than a simple feature story about veteran photographers. She was uncovering a family history that changed her understanding of both her grandfather and her own work as a photographer. More importantly, she was beginning to see that the criticism she faced for using film photography wasn't just about efficiency or modern convenience. It was about a fundamental misunderstanding of what photography could be when it was approached with the kind of careful attention and respect that her grandfather had brought to his work. The Veterans Administration exhibition was scheduled to open on a Thursday evening, exactly 1 week after Margaret had first learned about her grandfather's Silver Star. Dr. Mitchell had arranged for her to attend the private preview, where she would see her grandfather's war photographs displayed alongside the work of other military photographers from World War II. Margaret arrived at the VA Museum building early, carrying her grandfather's Leica camera in its worn leather case. She wanted to photograph the exhibition for the Tribune story, but more importantly, she wanted to experience seeing her grandfather's war work in the context it deserved. The exhibition hall was larger than she had expected, with professional lighting and carefully designed displays that emphasized the historical significance of the photographs. The central wall was dedicated to reconnaissance photography, with large prints showing the kinds of dangerous intelligence missions that had been crucial to Allied victory in the Pacific. Margaret found her grandfather's section near the center of the reconnaissance display. A placard identified him as Staff Sergeant Chun Wei-ming, 27th Infantry Division Photography Unit, and briefly described his service from 1943 to 1945. Below the text were 6 of his photographs, including the image from Tarawa that Margaret had found in the wooden box. But what took her breath away was the centerpiece of his display. Behind protective glass was an official Silver Star citation, awarded to Chun Wei-ming for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity in action against the enemy during photographic reconnaissance operations in the Marshall Islands, February 1944. The citation described how her grandfather had volunteered to photograph enemy fortifications on a heavily defended island, working alone and under constant threat of discovery. His photographs had revealed the location of hidden artillery positions that were subsequently neutralized before the American invasion, preventing what military planners estimated would have been hundreds of casualties. Margaret read the citation 3 times trying to process the fact that her gentle grandfather had risked his life in such an extraordinary way. The man she remembered teaching her to load film and adjust camera settings had once crawled through enemy territory to capture images that would save the lives of fellow soldiers. Dr. Mitchell approached while she was studying the display. "Your grandfather's Silver Star was actually recommended by 3 different commanding officers," he explained. The Marshall Islands mission was just one of several times he volunteered for extremely dangerous assignments. Military records show he turned down multiple opportunities to transfer to safer positions because he believed his photographic work was too important. Margaret learned that after receiving the Silver Star, her grandfather had continued his reconnaissance work through the end of the war. He had participated in operations at Saipan, Guam, and Okinawa, always carrying the same Leica camera and always maintaining the same careful, methodical approach that ensured his photographs provided the clearest possible intelligence. "The remarkable thing about your grandfather," Dr. Mitchell continued, "is that he never lost a roll of film to equipment failure or environmental damage. Other photographers would sometimes return from missions with unusable images because of water damage, humidity, or mechanical problems. Chen's photos were always perfectly exposed and technically sound." As Margaret continued through the exhibition, she began to understand how extraordinary her grandfather's service had been. The other military photographers displayed in the museum had done important work, but most had operated from relatively safe positions, documenting events after the fact rather than gathering intelligence during active operations. Frank Morrison, one of the veterans Margaret had interviewed, arrived at the preview with his family. At 96, he moved slowly, but his memory of wartime events remained sharp. When he saw Margaret studying her grandfather's display, he approached to share additional stories that hadn't come up during their formal interview. "Chen saved my life during the Saipan operation," Morrison said quietly. His reconnaissance photos showed enemy positions that intelligence had missed. "When our unit advanced, we knew exactly where the danger points were because of his work. Without those photographs, we would have walked into a trap." Morrison explained that military photographers like Chun Wei-ming had worked under conditions that made modern combat journalism seem safe by comparison. They carried minimal equipment, had no communication with their newsrooms, and often worked alone in territory where capture meant certain death. "The thing people don't understand about Chun," Morrison continued, "is that he could have taken any assignment he wanted after he proved himself. Officers were always trying to get experienced photographers for safer positions, documenting training operations, or working in established bases. But Chun kept volunteering for the dangerous missions because he knew that were the most important photographs needed to be taken." Margaret realized that her grandfather's choice to continue risking his life for photography wasn't recklessness or a desire for glory. It was a deep understanding of how powerful photographs could be when they captured truth that couldn't be obtained any other way. The preview event included a presentation by military historians about the role of photography in World War II intelligence operations. Margaret learned that reconnaissance photographs like her grandfather's had been crucial not just for tactical planning, but for strategic decisions that shaped the entire course of the Pacific War. Dr. Sarah Williams, a historian from the National Archives, explained that military photographers had documented evidence of war crimes, recorded the effectiveness of new weapons and tactics, and provided proof of events that would otherwise have been impossible to verify. These photographers were essentially journalists working under the most extreme conditions imaginable, Dr. Williams said during her presentation. They had to balance the need for accurate documentation with the practical requirements of military operations. Every photograph had to serve a specific intelligence purpose while also meeting the highest technical standards. Margaret thought about how her own work at the Tribune was criticized for being too slow and methodical, and she realized that speed had never been the point of great photography. The pressure to produce instant results was a modern convenience that often came at the cost of careful observation and thoughtful composition. During the presentation, Dr. Williams mentioned that the exhibition would travel to several other cities over the next year, and that the Veterans Administration was considering a companion book featuring the most significant military photographs from the collection. Margaret's grandfather's work would likely be featured prominently in such a publication. After the formal presentation, Margaret spent time talking with other family members who had attended to honor their relative's service. Many were surprised to learn details about their family members' wartime contributions that had never been shared at home. An elderly woman named Dorothy Kim approached Margaret after recognizing her grandfather's name on the display. "My father served in the same photography unit," she explained. He mentioned Chen Weiming many times over the years. He said Chen was the most skilled photographer he had ever worked with and the bravest person he knew. Dorothy's father had passed away several years earlier, but she remembered him saying that Chen Weiming had taught other photographers techniques for protecting their equipment and maintaining their cameras under battlefield conditions. Some of these techniques had been incorporated into military photography training that continued long after the war ended. As the evening progressed, Margaret began to understand that her grandfather's influence had extended far beyond his own photographic work. His methods and standards had shaped how military photography was approached for decades after World War II, and his technical innovations had been adopted throughout the armed forces. More importantly, from Margaret's personal understanding, she realized that the careful, methodical approach to photography that she had inherited wasn't just a family tradition or a stubborn preference for outdated methods. It was a professional standard that had been developed under the most demanding conditions possible and had proven its value when the stakes couldn't have been higher. Dr. Mitchell approached Margaret as the preview event was ending. "I hope you'll consider allowing us to display your grandfather's Leica camera as part of the traveling exhibition," he said. "It would help visitors understand the kind of equipment these photographers used and the technical challenges they faced." Margaret felt torn between wanting to honor her grandfather's legacy and needing the camera for her own work. But she realized that sharing his story was more important than protecting her own convenience. "I'll consider it," she said, "but I want to continue using the camera for my newspaper work. Could we arrange for it to be displayed only during times when I don't need it for assignments?" Dr. Mitchell agreed that such an arrangement would be possible, and he suggested that Margaret's continued use of the camera actually enhanced its historical significance. "The fact that it's still being used for journalism makes it a living piece of history rather than just a museum artifact," he explained. As Margaret left the museum that evening, she felt a profound shift in her understanding of both her grandfather and her own work. The Leica camera in her bag wasn't just a tool for taking photographs. It was a symbol of the highest standards of courage, precision, and dedication to truth that photography could represent. More importantly, she realized that the criticism she faced at the Tribune wasn't really about the camera or her methods. It was about a fundamental difference in understanding what photography could accomplish when it was approached with the kind of seriousness and respect that her grandfather had brought to his wartime service. Margaret returned to the Tribune newsroom the next morning with a completely different perspective on her work and her grandfather's legacy. She had spent most of the night writing her feature story about the Veterans Administration exhibition, weaving together the interviews with surviving veterans, the historical context of military photography, and the personal discovery of her grandfather's Silver Star. The story was unlike anything she had written before. Instead of the straightforward news reporting that typically filled the Tribune's pages, Margaret had crafted a narrative that connected the courage and technical precision of World War II reconnaissance photographers to the broader purpose of journalism in documenting truth under difficult conditions. She submitted the article to Morrison early that morning, along with carefully selected photographs she had taken at the exhibition using her grandfather's Leica camera. The images showed the displays, the veteran attendees, and details of the historical photographs in a way that conveyed both their historical significance and their emotional impact. Morrison read the article immediately, and Margaret could see his expression changing as he progressed through the story. When he finished, he called her into his office with an expression she couldn't interpret. "This is exceptional work, Margaret," he said, looking at both the article and the photographs. "You've written something that goes far beyond a typical feature story. This is the kind of journalism that reminds people why newspapers matter. But Morrison's praise was accompanied by a practical concern that Margaret had anticipated. The problem is that your story raises questions about our earlier discussions regarding your equipment and methods. If your grandfather's approach to photography was so valuable during the war, what does that mean for how we evaluate your work today? Margaret had prepared for this conversation during her sleepless night of writing. She understood that discovering her grandfather's Silver Star and learning about his military service didn't automatically resolve the practical challenges of working with film photography in a modern newsroom. I think the question isn't whether film photography is better than digital, she said carefully. It's whether there are situations where a more deliberate, methodical approach produces better results than rapid-fire shooting and immediate publication. Morrison nodded thoughtfully, but Margaret could see he was still struggling with the business realities of newspaper operations. Your grandfather's precision was valuable in military reconnaissance because intelligence required absolute accuracy, he said. But most of our assignments are about getting news to readers as quickly as possible. Margaret had anticipated this response, and she had developed a proposal that she hoped would address Morrison's concerns while allowing her to continue honoring her grandfather's legacy. What if we treated different types of assignments differently, she suggested. For breaking news and time-sensitive events, I could use digital equipment like everyone else. But for in-depth features, investigative stories, and assignments where the quality of individual images matters more than speed, I could continue using the Leica. Morrison considered this compromise, recognizing that it would allow the Tribune to benefit from Margaret's unique skills while still meeting the practical demands of daily news coverage. He agreed to a trial period where Margaret would use both approaches depending on the specific requirements of each assignment. The first test of this arrangement came the following week when a major industrial accident occurred at a chemical plant outside the city. Morrison assigned both Margaret and Sarah to cover the story, with Sarah handling the immediate news coverage and Margaret focusing on a longer-term investigative piece about safety conditions at the facility. Sarah arrived at the scene first, using her digital cameras to capture images of the emergency response and initial aftermath. Her photos were transmitted to the newsroom within hours and appeared on the Tribune's website and in the evening edition. Margaret took a different approach, spending several days at the scene and in the surrounding community. She used her grandfather's Leica camera to document not just the immediate damage from the accident, but the human impact on workers and families affected by the plant's safety problems. The deliberate process of film photography forced Margaret to spend more time with each subject, talking with people and understanding their stories before taking their pictures. She found that the visible presence of the vintage camera often made people more comfortable and willing to share their experiences. One photograph that particularly demonstrated the value of her approach showed an elderly worker who had been injured in the accident sitting with his granddaughter in their modest living room. The image captured both the man's dignity despite his difficult circumstances and the family's resilience in facing an uncertain future. Margaret had taken only 2 frames of this particular scene, but the care she had invested in understanding the family's story and waiting for the right moment resulted in an image that conveyed far more emotional depth than dozens of quick digital shots could have achieved. When Margaret's investigative story was published the following week, it generated significant community response and prompted state regulatory agencies to launch a comprehensive review of safety conditions at industrial facilities throughout the region. The success of Margaret's chemical plant investigation led Morrison to assign her to more complex, long-term stories where her methodical approach could produce unique results. She covered a series about elderly veterans struggling with healthcare access, using her grandfather's camera to create portraits that honored their service while documenting contemporary challenges. Margaret's colleagues gradually began to understand that her use of film photography wasn't about stubbornness or nostalgia. It was a deliberate choice that produced different kinds of results than digital photography, results that were particularly valuable for certain types of journalism. Sarah Martinez, who had been Margaret's most vocal critic, found herself requesting copies of Margaret's portraits for her own reference. The technical quality and emotional depth of images created with the Leica camera provided inspiration for improving her own work, even when using modern digital equipment. "I'm starting to understand what you get from that old camera," Sarah said during one of their conversations. "It's not that film is better than digital. It's that the process of using film makes you think differently about each picture." Margaret appreciated Sarah's growing understanding, but she also realized that the real value of her grandfather's approach went beyond the choice of equipment. The careful, methodical mindset that had made him an effective military photographer was applicable to any kind of camera or any professional situation that required precision and attention to detail. During this period, Margaret received a call from Dr. Mitchell at the Veterans Administration. The traveling exhibition featuring her grandfather's work was being enthusiastically received in cities across the country, and several military history organizations had requested permission to reproduce his photographs in books and educational materials. More significantly, the National Archives had decided to declassify additional photographs from Chun Wei-ming's service, including images from his most dangerous reconnaissance missions that had been considered too sensitive for public release until recently. Dr. Mitchell invited Margaret to Washington, D.C., to view these newly declassified photographs and to participate in a symposium about military photography that would be attended by historians, current military photographers, and journalism educators from around the country. The symposium would provide an opportunity for Margaret to share her grandfather's story with a national audience while also learning from other professionals who understood the connection between historical photography techniques and modern journalism standards. Margaret realized that her discovery of her grandfather's Silver Star had opened opportunities that extended far beyond her work at the Tribune. She was becoming recognized as an expert on the intersection between historical photography methods and contemporary journalism, a specialty that few other professionals could claim. But more importantly, Margaret understood that her grandfather's legacy wasn't just about the technical aspects of photography or even his wartime heroism. It was about approaching professional work with the kind of seriousness and dedication that ensured every effort contributed to something larger than personal success. The methodical process of loading film, carefully composing each shot, and waiting for results to be developed had taught Margaret patience and precision that improved all aspects of her journalism. These qualities were valuable regardless of what equipment she used or what assignment she covered. As Margaret prepared for her trip to Washington, she reflected on how much her life had changed since Morrison first questioned her use of outdated equipment. What had seemed like a professional liability had become the foundation for a unique career opportunity that honored both her family's history and the highest standards of journalism. The Leica camera had become more than just a tool for taking photographs. It was a symbol of the connection between past and present, between individual effort and historical significance, and between technical precision and moral purpose that defined the best aspects of both military service and journalistic integrity. The symposium in Washington, D.C. took place 6 months after Margaret first discovered her grandfather's war documents. She arrived at the National Archives building carrying the same worn leather case that had accompanied Chun Wei-ming through some of the most dangerous operations of World War II, now holding both his original Leica camera and a modern digital camera that Margaret had finally learned to use effectively. The event brought together military historians, active duty photography specialists, journalism professors, and working photographers from around the country. Margaret had been invited as both a family representative and a professional journalist who had successfully bridged historical photography techniques with contemporary news coverage. Dr. Mitchell introduced Margaret during the opening session, describing how her grandfather's story had emerged from a simple newspaper assignment and had led to broader recognition of the connection between military photography standards and civilian journalism excellence. Margaret Chen's work demonstrates that the precision and dedication required for military reconnaissance photography have direct applications in modern journalism. Dr. Mitchell explained to the audience. Her use of historical methods has produced contemporary results that remind us why these techniques were valuable in the first place. Margaret's presentation focused on the lessons she had learned from studying her grandfather's service and applying his approaches to her own work. She showed examples of photographs taken with the Leica camera alongside digital images of the same subjects, demonstrating how different tools and methods could produce different types of insights and emotional connections. One particularly striking comparison showed her coverage of a veterans' healthcare protest. The digital images effectively documented the event and provided clear information for immediate news coverage. But the film photographs captured individual moments of dignity and determination that conveyed the deeper meaning of the veteran's struggle for proper medical care. My grandfather's camera forces me to slow down and think about what I'm really trying to communicate, Margaret explained to the audience. When you can only take 36 pictures before changing film, every shot has to count. That mindset improves your work even when you're using equipment that allows unlimited images. During the question period following her presentation, a retired Air Force photographer raised his hand. Colonel James Wright had served as a military photography instructor for 20 years after his own combat service in Vietnam and the Gulf War. Your grandfather's work set standards that we still teach today, Colonel Wright said. The techniques he developed for maintaining equipment and ensuring image quality under extreme conditions became part of our training curriculum. Every military photographer trained since the 1950s has learned methods that your grandfather pioneered. Margaret learned that Chun Wei-ming's influence on military photography had continued long after his wartime service ended. His careful documentation of equipment maintenance procedures, environmental protection techniques, and tactical photography positions had been incorporated into training manuals that were still in use. More importantly, Colonel Wright explained that the mindset Margaret described in her presentation reflected core military photography principles that emphasized mission accomplishment over personal convenience or comfort. The difference between good military photographers and excellent ones, Colonel Wright continued, is the understanding that their work served a purpose larger than creating individual images. Your grandfather understood that his photographs could save lives and change the outcome of military operations. That sense of responsibility shaped everything he did. After the formal presentations, Margaret was approached by Dr. Elizabeth Hayes, a journalism professor from Columbia University who had been researching the influence of military photography techniques on civilian photojournalism. I've been following your work since the Veterans Administration exhibition, Dr. Hayes said. Your story represents something unique in contemporary journalism. You've demonstrated that historical methods aren't obsolete if they're applied thoughtfully to modern situations. Dr. Hayes invited Margaret to guest lecture at Columbia's Journalism School, where she would share her experiences with graduate students who were struggling to find their own professional identities in a rapidly changing media landscape. The invitation represented a significant opportunity for Margaret to influence the next generation of journalists while continuing to honor her grandfather's legacy. She accepted immediately, recognizing that teaching others about the value of precision and dedication would extend the impact of her grandfather's service beyond her own career. During her visit to the National Archives research facilities, Margaret was able to view the complete collection of her grandfather's declassified military photographs. Many images had never been publicly displayed because of their sensitive intelligence value, but they revealed the full scope of his service and the extraordinary risks he had taken to document crucial military information. One series of photographs showed Chun Wei-ming's documentation of Japanese defensive positions on Okinawa, taken from concealed positions that required him to remain motionless for hours while enemy patrols passed nearby. The technical quality of the images, combined with their obvious intelligence value, demonstrated both his photographic skill and his courage under impossible conditions. Dr. Mitchell explained that these Okinawa photographs had been instrumental in planning the final assault that ended the Pacific War. Military analysts had used Chin's detailed documentation of enemy fortifications to develop tactics that significantly reduced American casualties during the operation. Your grandfather's work directly contributed to saving thousands of lives during the war's final phase, Dr. Mitchell said, as they examined the photographs. His willingness to accept dangerous assignments and his technical expertise made him one of the most valuable intelligence assets in the Pacific Theater. Margaret realized that her grandfather's Silver Star represented only a small part of his overall contribution to the war effort. His consistent excellence over more than 2 years of combat operations had established standards and methods that influenced military photography for decades after the war ended. The symposium concluded with a ceremony honoring military photographers who had made significant contributions to both military operations and historical documentation. Margaret accepted a special recognition award on behalf of her grandfather, acknowledging his role in establishing professional standards that continued to influence both military and civilian photography. During her acceptance speech, Margaret reflected on the personal journey that had led her from defending her use of outdated equipment to understanding her grandfather's extraordinary legacy. 6 months ago, I thought my colleagues were right to criticize my old-fashioned methods, she said to the audience. I believed that clinging to film photography made me inefficient and out of touch with modern journalism. But learning about my grandfather's service taught me that efficiency isn't the only measure of professional excellence. Margaret explained that her grandfather's approach to photography had been shaped by situations where mistakes could cost lives and where every image had to serve a crucial purpose. These standards had created habits of precision and thoughtfulness that remained valuable long after the wartime circumstances that created them had passed. The camera my grandfather carried through World War II has taught me that technology is just a tool, Margaret continued. What matters is the dedication, skill, and sense of purpose that photographers bring to their work. Those qualities are timeless, regardless of what equipment we use. Following the ceremony, Margaret received offers to write a book about her grandfather's service and to develop a documentary film about military photographers who had influenced civilian journalism. Multiple museums requested permission to display Chun Wei-ming's photographs and equipment as part of permanent exhibitions about photography's role in military history. But perhaps most significantly for Margaret's daily life, Morrison called her from the Tribune newsroom to inform her that the newspaper's board of directors had approved funding for a new position, senior documentary photographer, a role created specifically to recognize Margaret's unique skills and to allow her to continue developing long-term investigative projects. The position would give Margaret the resources and time to pursue the kind of careful, methodical journalism that her grandfather's legacy had inspired, while also allowing her to mentor younger photographers in understanding the connection between technical precision and professional purpose. Margaret returned to her hometown with a fundamentally changed understanding of both her family's history and her own professional future. The Leica camera that had once seemed like a burden now represented a bridge between past and present, between individual achievement and historical significance. More importantly, Margaret had learned that honoring tradition doesn't require rejecting progress. Her grandfather's methods remained valuable not because they were old, but because they were based on principles that transcended any particular technology or time period. The careful attention to detail, the willingness to invest extra time in pursuit of excellence, and the understanding that professional work should serve purposes larger than personal convenience were qualities that improved any photographer's work, regardless of what equipment they used. Margaret continued using her grandfather's Leica camera for special assignments, but she also embraced digital photography when it was the appropriate tool for specific situations. The combination of historical methods and modern technology allowed her to produce journalism that honored both the precision of her grandfather's military service and the contemporary needs of Tribune readers. 6 months after the Washington Symposium, Margaret's investigative series about veteran healthcare issues won a state journalism award, with judges specifically citing the emotional depth and technical excellence of her photographic work. The series had led to policy changes that improved medical services for thousands of veterans throughout the region. During the award ceremony, Margaret carried her grandfather's Silver Star citation in her pocket, a reminder that excellence in any profession requires the same qualities that had made Chun Wei-ming an exceptional military photographer: courage, precision, dedication, and an understanding that individual work should contribute to something greater than personal success. The story had come full circle from colleagues laughing at outdated equipment to recognition that historical standards, when properly understood and applied, could enhance rather than hinder professional excellence in any era. Margaret's grandfather's legacy lived on not just in the photographs he had taken during World War II, but in the standards of excellence he had established for anyone willing to approach their work with the seriousness and dedication that important tasks deserve.